Welcome to video segment 4. If you recall, in video segment 3, we talked about development of a strategy map. And so once we've developed strategies for our strategic plans, it's time to think about how are we going to measure the success or assess the effectiveness of our strategic plan. So what evidence do we need to convince that the school district is actually accomplishing its mission and its student learning target? And how will all of these different stakeholder groups know that we've met or exceeded what the stakeholders wanted accomplished? So the balanced scorecard identifies the kind of evidence and quality levels that we would expect. And here's a hyperlink where you can actually look at a balanced scorecard and see that being implemented in a school district. So here is our example of a strategy map, and so we've developed strategies for each of these student or learning targets, so to speak, or in the business world, these would just be identified as their big objectives around learning and growth, their internal processes, how they satisfy customers, with these three things leading to profitability in the organization or big financial gain. So a balanced scorecard in a business would be used to measure the effectiveness of each of these big areas that identified. So you again can take a look at this YouTube video in relation to a scorecard being used in the business sector. This you recognize as UWI's strategy map. And so what are the possible ways to measure each of these learning targets or big areas identified in the business sector? Baldrige always measures their success in terms of their fiscal responsibility, support systems in education, employee development, stakeholder satisfaction, which leads to student learning. Here's an example of a balanced scorecard in education, and you can turn to pages 77 through 84 in your book. So here are their big student learning targets in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Here are their indicators of performance. Here's what's called leading or lagging indicators and the actual score on each one of those from the years 2009 through 2013. So review each of these areas to see how this scorecard shows evidence that indeed they are making progress towards their reading objectives, writing, and listening and speaking. A leading indicator is, I think, your book doesn't really define what that is, but if you watch some of these videos on balanced scorecards, I think it defines a leading indicator as where you're really making some big progress and showing growth, whereas a lagging indicator is where you need to grow even more. And so we'll maybe explore more in depth of what leading and lagging indicators are. Typically in some scorecards, those are identified in the education sector as leading and lagging indicators. Here's an example of a scorecard just taken off a website. It's kind of hard to see on this video, so we're going to move on. But the advantages to the balanced scorecard is it really defines the amount of progress that needs to be made. It provides also that documents the record of improvement trends that are provided to the Board of Education and other stakeholders, and really more importantly too, information that administrators and teachers need to determine what their gaps are in terms of strategy implementation and what adjustments are necessary. These are, again, more examples of education scorecards. This one is in the Montgomery County School District in Maryland. This one is a school district in Wisconsin, I believe, and I'm not sure exactly. I think this is Lamar School District in Georgia. So these are examples of 3 specific balanced scorecards that you can take a look at. A lot of times we're not exactly sure specifically with our stakeholders how we're going to measure our outcomes. So UWI suggests that we develop operational definitions for each of those measures. So operational definitions state exactly how the outcome is to be measured and how the data will be analyzed. And your book on page 70 gives an example of a student outcome, who owns the outcome or who is responsible for evaluating its effectiveness, what is the target for measurement, what's the instrument that's going to be used, what's the measurement process, and then how are we going to actually analyze that particular data. So for each outcome, UE suggests these 6 components be talked about in terms of measuring exactly how we're going to measure it and how we're going to analyze this data. So take a look at some sample operational definitions for student outcomes and process areas on page 70 and 71 in your book. And next week, if we have an opportunity, we're going to create some operational definitions for each of these goals. So you might want to take a look at those and see and compare this example to those examples in Yui's book on page 70, where he's actually developed some operational definitions. So measurement information is necessary for us to understand the success of our objectives and to find gaps in performance so that we can improve performance. And so many times in that data analysis process with our outcomes, we're looking for these statistical kinds of things to help give us a good sense of trends and whether or not we're accomplishing our objectives. And I know all of you are familiar with that because we do this as practitioners. We may not do these things ourselves as a practitioner. We might have someone in our district who calculates these things for us, or maybe not. Perhaps more what's common in our district is that we are looking at data over time, and that could be through local assessment data, state achievement data, but hopefully what we're doing, whatever results, we're comparing to a benchmark that we've established. And a definition of a benchmark is a target that sets high achievement levels. So if we go back to some of these scorecards, let's say perhaps we started our measurement of these outcomes in 2009. This is where we might like to be in terms of a benchmark. So it establishes where we want to be in the future. And I think we've all had conversations about those benchmarks. When we set them at high levels, but there's always that balance of setting benchmarks at high levels in terms of attainability. So if we set this at a benchmark at a high level, is it actually attainable? And sometimes when it's not attainable, we give up. And we can relate to that with No Child Left Behind. When those targets were set for us with state achievement levels, many of us felt that they just were not attainable. So that balance of a core planning team having that conversation of what should the benchmarks be so that they're not set too low, but they're not set too high, so that they're actually attainable but show substantial growth and indicates high expectations for our students, not low expectations. Oftentimes we use data dashboards in our districts to help us keep sense of our trends and our progress over time with our students. There are many companies. If you just do a Google search, of course, on a data dashboard, you're going to come up with lots of companies who have them. This is a hyperlink of a school district who uses a data dashboard to help them gauge improvement. And be thinking of examples that you can share in class of perhaps some programs, software programs that your district uses to help you keep track of your data. The next video will talk about the actual deployment of a strategic plan, and so I'm going to end this video segment too so that we can get into deployment. Once we've developed our strategic plan in terms of our mission, our vision, our student learning targets, our strategies, and we've set those scorecards so that we are able to collect evidence, how are we going to actually deploy the plan? So how does your district go about deploying their strategic plan?